Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture on Chapter 4, Sociological Theories of Race and Racism. The learning goals for this chapter and the questions that we'll be able to answer are the following. How is individual racism linked to institutional inequality? What are the key similarities and differences between systemic racism and structural racism? What is racial formation, and how does this concept inform our understanding of racial inequality? What does the perspective of Indigenous studies reveal about racism in the United States today? How is Islamophobia related to racism, and in what ways do race, class, and gender oppression work together? So racism today, as the chapter talked about, racial inequality and discrimination, are pervasive in the contemporary United States and can be seen in areas such as the criminal justice system, employment, education, and the healthcare system. Social scientists have carried out study upon study demonstrating that inequality and discrimination exist. Then how do we explain it? And so what we see in this chapter are different examples and different frameworks through which sociologists try to explain the racism that we continue to see today. So theories of racism include sociological theories, which are sociological explanations for how racial inequality is created and reproduced. Sociological theories of racism look both at how racism works and at how people are racialized. So it's looking at how racism works in our society, in our institutions and so on, but also how it affects people. Individual racism refers to individual acts of racism that are commonplace in our society and contribute to the reproduction of racial inequalities. And here are some examples of some of the studies that have documented individual racism. Fagan and McKinney's study in 2003 revealed that 80% of Black respondents had experienced racial hostility in public places. Dwana Robertson in 2015 found that Native Americans constantly suffer the consequences of negative stereotypes. And Raul Perez and Jeff Ward in 2019 found a prevalence of racist joking among police officers. One of the ways in which individual racism is experienced is through what are called racial microaggressions, which are daily commonplace insults and racial slights that cumulatively affect the psychological well-being of people of color. And in the reading, we saw one example of the kinds of things that people experience on a constant basis that seem innocent enough, but when you're constantly experiencing over and over again, they have an effect. One example is in the quote here that says, often when I have dinner at people's houses, they ask me if I would prefer chopsticks regardless of the meal. And this is from the perspective of an Asian American person. Institutional racism was introduced by Carmichael and Hamilton in 1967 in their book, Black Power. This concept refers to the policies, laws, and institutions that reproduce racial inequalities. Understanding the framework of institutional racism is essential for understanding racism in the United States. One example of institutional racism of the many that were discussed in the chapter are, for example, in the criminal justice system, when there are different kinds of sentencings for people who use crack cocaine versus powdered cocaine. The sentencing for possession of crack cocaine was significantly higher than possession of powdered cocaine. And part of that is because those that were primarily using crack cocaine, particularly in the 80s, were people of color. And those who used to primarily use powdered cocaine were white Americans. Another example that we see of institutional racism is captured in this image in schools, right? Where schools, the educational system as an institution has aspects of racism built into it. And we saw a number of examples discussed in the reading. Systemic racism gives primacy to history and to anti-Blackness, as it's defined here. It's a diverse assortment of racist practices encompassing daily microaggressions, deep-seated inequalities, and anti-Black ideologies, and includes things such as patterns of unjust impoverishment of non-whites, vested group interests of white people to maintain racism, omnipresent and routinized discrimination against non-whites, the rationalization of racial oppression, and an imbalance of power whereby white people are able to reproduce inequality through control of major political and economic resources. So to recap, institutional racism focuses on practices within institutions, and systemic racism focuses on accumulated acts of racism across history and throughout one's lifetime. Structural racism addresses interinstitutional interactions across time and space that reproduce racial inequality. So structural racism, in a way, connects institutional racism with systemic racism. This emphasis on the relationships among structures of institutional inequality provides insights to how racial inequality is reproduced across generations. So for example, racial inequality in housing leads to racial inequality in schooling, which in turn leads to racial inequality in the labor market. Across generations, this chain of events becomes a cycle, creating inequalities across multiple generations. And this is the kind of thing that we mean when we talk about structural racism, that it's long-term, across generations, across multiple institutions, and across historical time periods. One example of structural racism that was discussed in the reading is in the area of wealth. Structural racism reproduces wealth disparities. And you can see it here across different time periods and the different ways in which it manifests itself. So the failure to providing Black people with a material base after emancipation is one form of institutional racism that we see denied, where equality of wealth is denied to African Americans after they're emancipated. Then later on, we see the suburbanization of white people and the ghettoization of Black people. As white people move into the suburbs, those areas become predominantly white and middle class. And African Americans who were either not allowed to move into those areas because of discrimination or because they couldn't afford to move into those areas, end up ghettoized in particular kinds of neighborhoods. Finally, contemporary institutional racism in the lending and real estate markets is another contributing factor to structural racism and how it impacts the wealth disparities for African Americans, where racism in lending and real estate markets, right, where African Americans are denied loans or home loan to be able to purchase a home, means that they're kept out again from those suburban neighborhoods where the better schools are, which would then provide better educational experiences for their children, which could then increase their those children's, that next generation's ability to be able to move upward in the labor market in their careers, which could advance them in terms of their wealth. But again, all these different factors have been working throughout history to continue to create a disparity in terms of wealth for African Americans. And here in this graph, you see the median net worth by race and ethnicity between 1989 and 2016. Here you see the green line are the net worth of white folks. And you see in the bottom, the teal line representing African Americans. And so you see the large distance and disparity between where the line is for white folks and where the line is for African Americans over a significant period of time. Now, another theory that is used to try to understand racial inequalities was created by sociologist Omi and Wanant, where they talk about and use the framework of racial formation. And racial formation addresses the socio-historical process by which racial categories are created, inhabited, transformed, and destroyed. And they also talk about racial projects as simultaneously an interpretation, representation, or explanation of racial dynamics in an effort to reorganize and redistribute resources along particular racial lines. Now, when Omi and Wanant talk about racial projects, they assert that not all racial projects are racist. A racial project is defined as racist if it creates or reproduces structures of domination based on racial significations and identities. So for instance, in the definition of racial project, they talk about representation. So for example, if you see people of color represented in stereotypical ways in the media, then that would be a racist project, right? Where people are going out of their way to continue to uphold racist stereotypes of people of color in the media. Now, when people of color have organized to either protest stereotypical representations in the media or encourage movements to increase the representation of certain people of color groups that are not represented as much in the media, that would still be a racial project, but it's not a racist project because the effort is to try to create more equality in representation. Settler colonialism is the framework for considering present-day racism from the perspective of Native Americans. Andrea Smith, which is an indigenous scholar, argues that there are three pillars of white supremacy. 1, anti-Black racism, 2, genocide, and 3, Orientalism, as you see them depicted in this table. Anti-Black racism defines people as property, thereby justifying slavery in current forms of exploitation, and is rooted in a logic of capitalism that is designed to extract profit. Genocide is rooted in colonialism. This is the idea that Native people are disappearing and must disappear, and that therefore non-Native people have a right to everything that once belonged to Native people. Finally, Orientalism is rooted in the idea that certain nations or peoples pose a permanent threat to Western civilization and is therefore used to justify war, but also to exclude certain populations. So the reading explains that depending what framework you're using, you are addressing or could come up with different answers for understanding racism in our society. So from a perspective of settler colonialism, one might argue that the United States is an illegitimate state founded on genocide and must be dismantled. In other words, the nation of the United States is illegitimate because it was founded on was founded illegally by white people who came to this country and took over lands that did not belong to them and used colonial force to get rid of the Native American population. From a systemic racism perspective, one might argue that the United States is founded on a history of racism and that the Constitution should be rewritten. So this is a different perspective that gives us a different answer for how we understand the United States and the history of racism that exists within it, and what might be a way to address it. From a racial formation perspective, one might argue that the United States is headed in the right direction, and through more struggles for justice and civil rights, it will complete the transition from racial dictatorship to racial democracy. And the reading talked about how one of the aspects of the racial formation theory, one of their arguments, is that the United States historically has been shifting from a racial dictatorship, for instance, from the time of slavery and Jim Crow laws and so on, to a racial democracy post-civil rights movement era. One of the other things that the reading brings up to sort of further complicate things, right, is this question of, is Islamophobia racism? Now, Islam is a religion. Does it make sense then to define Islamophobia, which is defined as the systemic marginalization of Muslims, as racism? And the reading talks about Islamophobia as a kind of cultural racism because Americans conflate religion with culture. And another framework is to sort of address this question, talks about racializing religion, how religion, even though it's not a race, right? Christianity is not a race, Islam is not a race, ends up becoming racialized because of the particular characteristics that become attached to a particular religion. So religion has been perceived as a cultural characteristics viewed as inherent, as judged based on cultural traits such as language, clothing, and religious practices. Muslims, therefore, are racialized based on their religious characteristics, right? So Muslims are not just racialized like other groups are based on skin color and so on, but they're racialized based on their particular religious characteristics, which are considered innate and therefore experience racism as a result, right? And so Muslims are identified by other things other than skin color, in addition to skin color, but they're also identified by certain religious characteristics. For example, women who wear the hijab. That is something that people can point to as a marker of that individual being Muslim, and then proceeds to attach to that person whatever other stereotypes they may have about that person based on their Muslim identity. The reading also talked about how race, class, and gender oppression work together, right? That you can't look at just race separately from other identities as well. And the concept that is used to understand this is the idea of intersectionality, which is a simultaneous look at various forms of oppression. The reading talks specifically about white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism as systems of oppression that work together to create experiences of oppression for different folks. They also explain how intersectionality applies to everyone, not just people of color. So white, male, heterosexual, cisgender men also have, right, race, they have a gender, they have a class, identity, and so on. And those same forms of oppression work together to either provide benefits, right, advantages, privileges, or disadvantages, right? So it's not just something that we look at for people who fit the minoritized identity for their class or sexuality or race and so on, but it works to look at how different forms of different systems of oppression work to impact different kinds of individuals. So in conclusion for this chapter, theories of institutional, systemic, and structural racism give us different frameworks for understanding the deep-seated nature of racial inequality in the United States. But also sociologists and other thinkers continue to develop ways for understanding inequality, right? So if you're hoping to be able to reach a point where there's one idea that encompasses it all, that explains it all, and that provides a solution to all of it, that doesn't exist, and it's probably unlikely to exist in the future. But what we have are multiple ways, right, that people have spent a lot of time and study and research developing to help us understand how inequalities, how different disparities and so on continue to exist between different groups, even today. Okay. All right. So this ends the lecture for this week. I look forward to seeing you on the discussion post. You all have a good week.